Imagine being told that the state intends to end your life. Not tomorrow, not next month, not even next year. Instead, you wait. Days become months, months become years, years become decades. Every appeal offers hope. Every rejection brings another weight. Some condemned prisoners spent almost half a century, knowing exactly how their story would end. Today, we're examining the longest waits on death row before execution. Michael Selsor was sentenced to death in Oklahoma after the murder of a convenience store clerk during a robbery in 1975. His case would become tangled in years of legal appeals. The original death sentence was overturned. Later, prosecutors once again sought the death penalty, more than 38 years after the crime. Selsor was executed by lethal injection in 2012. By then, nearly 4 decades had passed. As his execution date approached, Michael Bascom Selsor was asked to choose one final meal. He requested a Kentucky Fried Chicken meal consisting of 2 chicken breasts, a wing, and an extra thigh, served with potato wedges, baked beans, 2 biscuits with honey, and an apple turnover. Salt, pepper, and ketchup completed the order. In his final moments, he turned his thoughts to those he loved. My son, my sister, I love you. Until I see you again, be good. Eric, keep up with the struggle. I'll be waiting at the gates of heaven for you. I hope the rest of you will make it there as well. I'm ready. Moments later, the execution was carried out. Brandon Jones was sentenced to death in Georgia after the murder of a convenience store manager during a robbery in 1979. For decades, his execution was delayed by appeal after appeal. Courts reviewed evidence. Lawyers challenged procedures. Executions were scheduled, then postponed. Finally, in 2016, after almost 37 years on death row, Brandon Jones was executed. Unlike many inmates facing execution, Brandon Jones chose not to request a final meal. Instead, under Georgia Department of Corrections policy, he was served the standard prison dinner: chicken and rice, rutabagas, seasoned turnip greens, white beans, cornbread, bread pudding, and fruit punch. It was an ordinary meal, marking the final hours of a man who had spent nearly 37 years awaiting execution. Carrie Dean Moore was sentenced to death in Nebraska after murdering 2 Omaha taxi drivers during a robbery spree in 1979. Convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, he entered Nebraska's death row later that same year. What followed would become one of the longest waits for execution in American history. For nearly 38 years, his case remained trapped in the courts. Appeal followed appeal. Questions over Nebraska's death penalty laws. Challenges to the state's execution procedures. And years of legal delays repeatedly pushed his execution further into the future. Execution dates were scheduled, then postponed. Decades passed while Moore remained inside the same prison system, watching the years slip away. Finally, in 2018, after almost 38 years on death row, the legal process came to an end. Carrie Dean Moore became the first person executed in Nebraska in more than 21 years, and the first in the state to be put to death using a fentanyl-based lethal injection protocol. Unlike many condemned inmates, Moore declined to request a special final meal. Instead, he was served the standard prison dinner provided by the Nebraska Department of Correctional Services. It was an ordinary meal, marking the final hours of a man who had spent almost 4 decades awaiting execution. Asked if he wished to make a final statement, Moore quietly replied, "I have no final statement." At 10:47 a.m. on the 14th of August, 2018, Carrie Dean Moore was pronounced dead. 38 years after entering death row, his wait was finally over. Thomas Knight was sentenced to death after murdering a Miami couple during a kidnapping in 1974. He entered Florida's death row in 1975, beginning what would become one of the longest waits for execution in American history. Years later, while serving that sentence, Knight committed another shocking murder, stabbing prison officer James Burke to death inside Florida State Prison. Already condemned to die, he was sentenced to death for a second time. For almost 39 years, his case remained locked in a cycle of appeals, legal challenges, and repeated delays. Execution dates came, then went, while decades passed behind prison walls. Finally, in January 2014, after nearly 39 years on death row, every remaining appeal had been exhausted. Thomas Knight was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Unlike many inmates, Thomas Knight chose a final meal that was almost entirely made up of desserts and snacks. He was served sweet potato pie, coconut cake, banana nut bread, strawberries, butter pecan, and vanilla ice cream, a handful of Fritos corn chips, and a small amount of Sprite. When asked if he wished to make a final statement, Knight simply replied, "No." At 6:25 p.m. on the 7th of January, 2014, Thomas Knight was pronounced dead. Nearly 4 decades after first entering death row, his wait was finally over. William Earl Lynd was sentenced to death after abducting and murdering 26-year-old Ginger Moore near Rome, Georgia, in December 1974. He entered Georgia's death row the following year, beginning what would become the longest wait before execution in modern American history. For almost 39 years, his case wound its way through state and federal courts. Appeals were filed, hearings were held, and execution dates came and went, while decades quietly passed inside a prison cell. By the time every legal avenue had finally been exhausted, nearly 4 decades had passed since the crime. On the 6th of May, 2008, William Earl Lynd was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. For his final meal, he requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, green beans, bread rolls, apple pie, and iced tea. When asked if he wished to make a final statement, Lynd declined. At 7:51 p.m., William Earl Lynd was pronounced dead, 39 years after entering death row. The longest recorded wait before execution had finally come to an end. Until next time, this has been Archive 0.